Okay, year 11. So now we come to the poetry question. So remember, we've had a look at it already. We remember that the key theme is conflict. And what I'm going to do, and what I would maybe potentially suggest, I'm going to put in big letters there, conflict. So I'm going to make sure that I keep coming back to that. I'm not going to let the examiner be able to accuse me of shifting off of focus on not answering the question. I'm going to make sure that that word, I'm going to kind of seed it throughout and make sure it's laced in there throughout. So all the time, they're always going to know what I'm answering on. So my first question is, we've got conflict, we've got emigrate, and we've got remains. So I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to look at emigrate. I'm going to think, right, I need to pick two really good quotes that I can say two different points about the conflict. Now, having looked through, we all know this poem. There's two real elements of conflict in this poem. One of the conflicts is almost the cultural conflict. So I'm just going to put emigrate here, because I know I'm going to need me two Cal's paragraphs for this. The first thing I'm going to look for is that cultural conflict, the idea that there's a conflict between what she needs. She wants to go back to kind of or remind herself and keep reminding herself of her original culture while she's moved into this new culture. But there's a real friction there that it feels to her like in this new culture she's been asked to forget that.
So a conflict of identity almost.
Yeah. And I think the thing that runs through, we're told time and time again, you get sunlight running through. So we've got this little wonderful phrase that she talks about her original language and the fact it tastes of sunlight, okay, which I think is wonderful because it's this idea. I think there's a conflict there, and I think it's this wonderful metaphor. All right, or if we want to say, we could even call it a metaphoric noun, whatever you want to say, metaphor, metaphoric noun. But it's the fact she calls it sunlight. So we have to then think of ourselves, right, what's that kind of showing? And really what sunlight's showing, it's something that we need to grow. All right, so if she's a young person, I always read it as a young person, it's something that we need to grow and develop. If you remove sunlight from plants, it can't grow. So I think the conflict there's a conflict of identity and culture. All right? It's this idea of what she needs is being kept from her. So she's ultimately almost that plant needing sunlight that's been shut in a dark cupboard. And actually, this is the conflict, one of the two big conflicts with her, that she feels like she's been denied what is needed.
And yes, she responds to the memory of the place in terms of their senses. The sense of taste is an unusual one that's been selected there.
And alongside this, so our first big idea is this idea of the culture, but there's another conflict going on, which is kind of linked to that, and it's the conflict against memory and time. Because I think we're meant to assume, well, she says, I left it as a child, so we're meant to assume that it's a long time since she visited this place. So actually, she's fighting to keep the memories, okay? And as she's fighting to keep the memories, we are told that time rolls its tanks. Right, so it's this idea that her memories have almost become a war zone. So these memories, these things that she treasures, her link back to her original culture, they are almost, she's at war to kind of keep those. It's become a war zone. Now, obviously, she's making a slight reference to that because where she left was a war zone, but it's more this idea that she loves where she left. And it's almost like she's fighting a battle on a daily basis to try and retain this and that internal conflict. Every day she wakes up and she might be able to remember it just a little bit less. And I think this kind of personification of time, right, making time a person, almost like this enemy rolling its tanks, this kind of enemy threat in kind of a war. She's fighting a battle. So I'm going to put there's a conflict in her mind.
She's already referred to being sick with tyrants, and almost like time itself is another tyrant, another dictator.
So we're faced with someone who's kind of fighting a war on two flanks. She's fighting a war in reality against the people, saying she can't speak the language she wants to speak, she can't retain this culture, but she's also fighting a war in her head, a conflict in her head, which is going to be against the fact that her memories are slowly fading. So I think in the 20 minutes, and again, your teacher may have told you to do this slightly differently, what I would potentially suggest is, I'd really think in that 45 minutes, I'd think I've got 20 minutes to really go to town on those, to give myself two good Cal's paragraphs where I can really pin down the conflict. And remember, that stays there because it's not just things I know about emigrate, it's not just anything I can say about these quotes, it's any of these ideas, but keep bringing them back to conflict. So the examiner really feels after those 20 minutes that I've really explained what conflict is presented as in this poem.
We're saying emigrate is a difficult one for the context because it's not one specific place. It could be anybody who's ever emigrated, who's ever left somewhere in a war zone. So there's lots of interpretations. People apply it to Syria, people apply it to Vietnam, even to Russia in Animal Farm, for example. Okay, wealthy Russian emigres who left like Molly the Mayor. But it's just that idea that you can still recognise with a sentence or two in those paragraphs of your context, just the idea of how the conflict reflects those people who have left one place but in a way are still trapped there and imprisoned. They're haunted by their memories. It's a positive memory, but at the same time they find it impossible to move on because they are haunted by that.
And another thing, just to drop in there, because context, as Mr. Barber says, it's of all the poems, the Emigre seems to be the one that is immune from context
Like
right
tissue.
the most. And tissue, but the less about tissue today, the better. One thing I would say, just to throw in there, the poet Carol Rumans, she was born in 1944. Now, it's a slightly tenuous thing, but just something to think about. She was born and brought up at a time when there was huge migration around the world. So somewhere like Britain was, for the first time, dealing with kind of the cultural connotation of influx of people from around the world and how kind of their culture was accepted and the frictions that caused. So again, she kind of lived through that moment when people were coming from all different continents, and that idea of having to kind of bring their culture with them, the conflict that they face. So potentially something that could just be mentioned, the idea that she will have seen this in Britain and how Britain's kind of that kind of friction and conflict that's sometimes even still there today in 2019 when different cultures kind of potentially clash and the conflict there. So just something to think about for the
You
context.
could even tie in with Brexit and the complications of migration today.
Okay, so we're quite happy that's going to be our 20 minutes on Emigrate. Now we need to think, right, on Remains. We've got to flip it now. We've got our 3 quotes that we wrote down when we did our dump, as it were. Now we've got to think, right, I don't just want to say the same thing twice. Again, I would always think, right, remind yourself, stop and think, Remains, conflict. What is the conflict in Remains? We all know what the conflict is. It's this guy who's desperately trying to deal with the guilt of what's happened. He's suffering from PTSD. He's left the army. He's come home. He can't escape the horrible memories. He's turned to drink. He's turned to drugs. And it's just haunting him. So we've really got to try and capture that in 20 minutes, in 2 paragraphs. That's what we're looking to capture.
With that real-life story of Guardsmen, Tromans and the Iraq War, bringing that in, that sense of the specific biographical backstory that helped Sam Armitage to write this in the first person as if he is Guardsmen, Tromans.
Now, I'm going to start with this because it's one of the big quotes. Drink and drugs won't flush him out. Pardon me. We talk about the fact that he turns to drink and drugs. So there's that conflict, there's that idea that he can't control it, he's lost control. So I'm going to put it's a mental conflict, all right, and there's a desperation. I feel like he's turned to, we know from the context, he turned to the military and they didn't offer any support. He's returned home, he's tried to deal with it, he tried to leave it behind in the war zone. That didn't help. He's now turning to, he's abusing substances, he's becoming an alcoholic, he's becoming a drug addict, and again, it won't flush him out. All right, so this idea, it's this man is still alive, all right? So the victim or the man he killed, he's very much still alive in his head, he's very present. It's this idea he can't move on from it. So I think it's this moment of mental conflict and this desperation. In terms of language, because remember, we should be looking and thinking of what we're going to talk about in terms of what did Armitage choose. Now, some of us are going to go, oh, that's easy, sir. All right, drink and drugs, we've got a lovely bit of alliteration. All right, big point to be made here. The exam board have made it very explicitly clear that alliteration can only be used if you are making a point about the sound. So if we can make a point about the duh, potentially we could use that. But if all we're going to say is it's alliteration just for the fact that there's 2 words near each other beginning with D, then actually that should be avoided because they don't see any worth in that. So just be aware of that. That counts for your anthology, when you're doing about your unseen poetry. There might be a moment when it might have lots of and it might be secretive or it might be someone cold as an exposure. Absolutely fine. But if there's actually no sound value to the alliteration, just avoid it.
So sibilance is fine when it's like stormed out with shot and shell, the gunfire in Chartered Light Brigade, or when it's sudden successive streaks of bullets streak the silence in Exposure. So when you've got sound effects and you've got the shattered visage of the sand in Ozymandias, okay, or you've got the spits like a tame cat turned savage, and you've got the sea spraying everything in Storm on the Island. The sibilance, very much the sound effect, is grouping those words together. Drink and drugs, the dr sound is grouping together the 2 poor personal choices that he's making. So that's, you could make that as a point, but there are easier ways to get your money, as Sir's going to show you.
So if we can't use the alliteration, what do we use? Well, for me, there is a big language choice here, and that is this. I think the metaphoric verb. All right. By the way, when I write metaphoric, if you were to call it a metaphor, that is also fine. But I just think if we call it a verb, he's not really flushing anyone out of his head or trying to flush him out. It's a metaphoric verb. So I think that's one of those things we can say. And again, when we refer to this language, we're not going to put the metaphoric verb flush. We're going to make phrases like, Armitage selected the metaphoric verb. Armitage chose to use or chose to employ. Remember, we're going to make it very clear, whenever we can, that these are choices being made by a writer. Right? The more you can do that, the more you can keep reminding them that you're not really analysing Gosman Tromans, you're analysing Simon Armitage and the choices that he made. But anyway, let's come back to this. So, flush. And I think it's that idea that if we talk about flush, it's the idea that we try and flush things away. It's when we get rid of waste products, it's the idea we want to get rid of them. We want to kind of forget about them, want them to disappear out of our lives, and we need that to happen if we're to move forward in a healthy manner. So it's this idea that he's now at the point where he's so desperate. This isn't just he could do with him being forgotten about. It's the idea that he's having a massively negative impact on his mental health and his physical health. So we've got this utter desperation and there's like a hopelessness, all right, to it. So that's where I think I would start, because I think I could tie a lot of things in with that. We can really capture the first thing, this conflict that he's struggling to cope with. I think the second thing is the Volta. I think the blood shadow is good, but I think in many ways if I've got this blood shadow, and that might be something I can tie into this paragraph, because it kind of is the same thing, this idea it's following him around and he can't leave it behind. So I think blood shadow's staying there, but I think end of story except not really, which is obviously the Volta, is a wonderful moment, because it's the idea that conflict, it's the conflict can't be controlled. I think that's what I'm going to go with. And again, there might be other things we can say about it, but it's the fact that the conflict can't be controlled. Just to explain that a little more, I think the theory is, up until that point in the poem, he's in the war zone. He's killed a man, he's struggling to deal with it, but there's almost this hope that when he returns on leave back to civilian life, that war will stay at war and life can continue. And it's that horrible moment of revelation when we realise that conflict and the impact of mental conflict and the impact of things that are seen at war, they can't be left at war. So it's this idea, end of story, except not really. So kind of, it's almost like if it had finished there, if the sentence had finished there, that's what we think, but here's the reality. So it's, and I love the fact he uses the noun story.
Usually voltas occur with a but, okay? It's that conjunction but except is another of those words to look out for, particularly on the unseen poetry as well. So the conjunction except, following the story.
And again, I think the noun story is wonderful because it's almost Armitage or Tromans or everyone basically saying, that's the story we're told. We're told, and a story is a fiction, something that's not true, is we're meant to believe the story that a soldier can do these terrible things or live through these terrible things at war and then come home and be perfectly normal and go to Tesco's and go and play with the kids in the park. But actually, it's a story. He's almost pointing out the fact that that's what he was told, but now he is the reality behind it. Okay, so it's kind of reveal, it's that revelation of the reality behind it, that conflict is life, it's life-changing if you live through this conflict, and you cannot section it off, and it's not, you can't be a different person in Barnsley than you are in Iraq if you've been to war. That's the same person. You're going to bring all the baggage, it's going to follow you around. Again, that might be where we can go back and we can maybe tie our blood shadow into this one potentially.
And you could even, at the end, the fact that this is a story, like a fairy story, like something that is too good to be true, and of course it isn't, unfortunately. That ties in with the first line of the Emigre, which started with "There once was a country," that fairy tale opening, sort of almost like once upon a time. Okay, that's the beginning to a story. Here, this should be the end of it, but it's going to become more nightmarish, more dystopian because of the conflict that he is unable to walk away from. As one war ends, the official war, his personal nightmare, his personal war now begins, and it is ongoing and it is relentless. And
I think so. We're sat in. I feel quite confident that we're going to give ourselves lots of marks for that first 20 minutes when we talk about the Emigre. We're going to give ourselves lots of marks in that second 20 minutes when we talk about Remains. All I'd be looking for, because again, we don't want to make these huge comparisons. I don't think we intertwine them too much because that way we get confused. But any moment, if we talk about Emigre, it would be nice for a moment when we talk about Emigre across the two, if there's a moment we can just make a little link across like Sir just did to the first line. Right, if you can just have that moment when this is similar to the first line in the Emigre, which almost sounds like a fairy tale. Even if it doesn't involve a quote, just that moment where just once, potentially across the two paragraphs, they'll just see the alternative poem name in there, and the examiner will just be quiet. It just reassures them that you're staying focused on conflict, you're going to town on one poem, but just dropping that name in just once, either side, just makes them know that you know the other one's there, and they're not being done in utter isolation.
As a similarly or a conversely sort of moment. And you mentioned something about the exam board, like it as being rather than a comparison, see it more as...
They call it a connection. So it's just that moment. Again, don't worry about this. It doesn't need to affect your calc. It's not something that should... And again, I know some people have thought about doing one poem, then another, one poem, then another. But actually, I think just think about the connection. Do one, do the other, and just once each time, just make a little connection between the two, and you'll be fine.